Derek and Maria Broaddus had barely begun to savor the excitement of owning their dream home when their idyllic vision shattered. The six-bedroom Dutch colonial at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey, promised a fresh start for their family, a place where their three young children could grow up safely in a picturesque neighborhood. But just days after closing on the $1.3 million property, an unsettling letter arrived. It was addressed to the new owner and signed by someone calling themselves the Watcher. The message began innocently enough, welcoming them to the neighborhood. But the tone quickly darkened. The writer claimed that their family had been watching over the house for decades, waiting for its second coming. And now it was Derek and Maria's turn to care for it. The letter was far from generic. It revealed intimate details about the Broaddus family, mentioning their children and referring to them as young blood. The writer questioned why the family had chosen 657 Boulevard and hinted at sinister motives. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed to bring me your children? The final lines were chilling. Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. Welcome, my friends. Welcome. Let the party begin. Derek immediately contacted the police, but the investigation yielded no leads. The previous owners admitted they had received a similar letter before selling the house, but dismissed it as a harmless prank. Feeling the weight of the letter's ominous tone, Derek and Maria decided to delay moving in while renovations continued. They hoped to uncover any hidden truths about the house and its history. But as the days passed, more letters arrived, each more unsettling than the last. The Watcher seemed to be monitoring their every move, commenting on the changes they were making to the property. The house cries for the past, one letter read. Stop changing it and let it breathe. Another questioned whether they had discovered what was hidden within its walls, hinting at secrets buried deep inside the structure. The Broaddus family began to dread even visiting the property, afraid of what or who might be lurking nearby. The paranoia seeped into their daily lives. Derek installed security cameras around the perimeter, but even with surveillance, they felt exposed. Every passerby became a suspect. Every glance towards 657 Boulevard a potential threat. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her children whenever they played outside. At night, Derek would drive by the house, scanning for any signs of movement or suspicious activity. The once thrilling prospect of owning their dream home had turned into a waking nightmare, and their unease only deepened when investigators revealed that no fingerprints or DNA had been found on the letters. Despite their growing fear, Derek and Maria refused to let the house defeat them. They hired a private investigator to dig into the history of 657 Boulevard and its neighbors. The investigator uncovered that the house had been a source of fascination and perhaps obsession for decades. One family had owned it for nearly 50 years, and during that time, several neighbors recalled odd occurrences around the property. However, no concrete evidence tied anyone to the Watcher. Meanwhile, the Broaddus family began to suspect everyone. The elderly man who lived next door and rarely left his home, the couple across the street, who always seemed to be watching through their curtains. No one was above suspicion. The letters continued to arrive sporadically, each one more invasive than the last. In one particularly chilling message, the Watcher described seeing the children by name and asked if they had ventured into the basement yet. It would be so easy for them to get lost down there, the letter read. The house is big enough for them to disappear without a sound. Maria stopped sleeping altogether, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Derek became consumed with finding answers, poring over old property records and neighborhood gossip late into the night. But no matter how much they searched, the Watcher remained a ghost, an invisible presence terrorizing their lives. The Broaddus family's ordeal soon became public knowledge, and the media descended on Westfield like vultures. Headlines screamed about the Watcher house, turning their private nightmare into a spectacle. Strangers drove by 657 Boulevard, some snapping photos, others daring each other to approach the property. The once quiet neighborhood was now buzzing with curiosity and rumors. Some locals sympathized with the Broaddus family, but others weren't so kind. Online forums speculated that Derek and Maria had fabricated the letters to escape the financial burden of the house or to attract attention for a potential movie deal. The accusations stung, adding another layer of torment to their already fragile state. Amid the chaos, Derek and Maria began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior. They grew distant from friends and family, consumed by paranoia and distrust. Every interaction felt loaded with suspicion. Even casual conversations with neighbors seemed tinged with ulterior motives. Maria started avoiding public places altogether, terrified that someone might recognize her as the woman from the Watcher house. Derek's obsession deepened. He spent hours driving through Westfield, noting license plates, and photographing strangers who lingered near the property. Their once happy life had become a prison, with 657 Boulevard as its warden. Desperate for answers, Derek and Maria decided to confront the previous owners, the Woods family, who had lived in the house before selling it. The Woods admitted to receiving a single letter from the Watcher shortly before they moved out, but they had dismissed it as a harmless prank. This revelation infuriated Derek, who felt the Woods should have disclosed the letter before selling the property. He filed a lawsuit against them, claiming they had knowingly sold a house with a history of harassment. The legal battle attracted even more media attention, further isolating the Broaddus family and deepening their humiliation. As the months dragged on, Derek and Maria began to consider drastic measures. They toyed with the idea of selling the house at a loss, but every potential buyer balked when they learned about the Watcher. Some suggested tearing the house down entirely and splitting the land into 2 lots to make it easier to sell. But even that plan was met with resistance from the town's planning board, which deemed it out of character for the neighborhood. Trapped by circumstances beyond their control, the Broaddus family felt as though 657 Boulevard had become a living entity, one that refused to let them go. The psychological toll of living under constant threat began to manifest in unexpected ways. Maria started hearing faint noises at night, soft creaks, distant thuds that she couldn't explain. Even though they hadn't moved into the house, she convinced herself that the Watcher might have found a way inside. Derek, on the other hand, became consumed by anger. He would sit in his car outside 657 Boulevard for hours, staring at the darkened windows, daring the Watcher to reveal themselves. The tension between them grew unbearable. They were no longer just fighting an external enemy, but also battling their own unraveling. Sanity. One evening, Derek decided to take matters into his own hands. He wrote anonymous letters to several neighbors, accusing them of being the Watcher and demanding they confess. It was a reckless move, born out of desperation, and it only made things worse. The neighbors began to view the Broaddus family as unstable and untrustworthy. Some even started avoiding them entirely, refusing to answer their calls or acknowledge them in public. Derek's actions had backfired spectacularly, leaving the family more isolated than ever. And yet, the letters from the Watcher kept coming. As the years passed, the Broaddus family's life became a cycle of fear, frustration, and hopelessness. The once vivid dream of raising their children in the perfect home had turned into a grim reality they couldn't escape. They tried renting out the house to tenants, hoping to recoup some of their losses, but even that came with complications. One tenant agreed to move in under the condition that a clause be added to the lease allowing them to break it if another letter from the Watcher arrived. Within weeks, a new letter did appear. "Welcome back to 657 Boulevard," it read. "The Watcher is pleased to know its new residents have arrived." The letter was more threatening than ever, filled with cryptic warnings and references to the tenants' daily routines. It was clear that whoever the Watcher was, they were still keeping a close eye on the house. The tenants moved out almost immediately, leaving Derek and Maria back at square one. By this point, they had spent years trying to sell or rent the property with no success. Their finances were stretched thin, and their mental health was in tatters. The house had become an albatross around their necks, a constant reminder of everything they had lost. By 2019, Derek and Maria had reached their breaking point. After 5 years of torment, they finally managed to sell 657 Boulevard, but at a significant financial loss. The new owners were aware of the house's dark history and the letters from the watcher, but they chose to move in regardless. For the Broaddus family, it was a bittersweet moment. They were free from the house that had haunted them for so long, yet the scars of their experience lingered. Maria described feeling like they had been chased out of their own lives, while Derek admitted he still drove by the house occasionally, unable to fully let go. Even after selling the property, the mystery of the watcher remained unsolved. The police investigation had gone cold, and no new leads ever surfaced. The Broaddus family tried to rebuild their lives, but the trauma followed them everywhere. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them, even in their new home. For Derek and Maria, the question of who or what the watcher was became less important than learning how to live with the fear it had instilled in them. The story of 657 Boulevard became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. For the residents of Westfield, the legend of the watcher became a permanent stain on their otherwise idyllic town. Some neighbors whispered that the Broaddus family had brought the trouble upon themselves, while others believed the watcher was still lurking among them, waiting for the next family to claim 657 Boulevard. Over time, the house became a local oddity. Children dared each other to walk past it at night, and urban legends began to swirl about its cursed nature. Yet, for all the speculation, no one ever came forward with definitive proof of who the watcher was, or why they had targeted the Broaddus family. Derek and Maria tried to avoid the media frenzy that continued to surround their story, but it wasn't easy. Documentaries, podcasts, and even fictionalized accounts of their ordeal kept their nightmare alive in the public consciousness. Strangers would recognize them in grocery stores or on the street, asking invasive questions, or offering unsolicited theories about the watcher's identity. It was as if they could never escape the shadow of 657 Boulevard. For their children, who had grown older during this ordeal, the house became a symbol of everything they wished to forget. A place where innocence had been stolen and replaced with something far darker. Even after moving away, Derek found himself obsessing over the watcher. Late at night, he would scour online forums and news articles, searching for any new information about the case. He read theories ranging from plausible to absurd. Some speculated that the watcher was a disgruntled neighbor, angry about the renovations, while others believed it was part of a larger conspiracy involving the town's elite. Maria, on the other hand, tried her best to move on. She refused to talk about the house or the letters, hoping to shield their children from the trauma that had consumed their lives for so many years. But the fear never truly left them. Every creak in their new home, every unfamiliar car parked on their street, brought back memories of 657 Boulevard. Maria began double-checking locks and keeping the curtains drawn at all times. Derek installed security cameras around their new property, just as he had done before. The watcher had robbed them of more than just their dream home. It had stolen their sense of safety and trust in the world around them. And though they tried to rebuild their lives, the specter of the watcher loomed large, an invisible presence they could never fully escape. Years later, Derek and Maria began to notice how their ordeal had changed them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Derek had grown more withdrawn, his once outgoing personality replaced by a quiet, almost obsessive demeanor. He rarely trusted anyone outside of their immediate family, and even casual interactions with strangers felt fraught with suspicion. Maria, on the other hand, had developed an almost compulsive need for control. She meticulously planned every aspect of their lives, from errands to vacations, as if by staying ahead of things, she could prevent another disaster like the Watcher. Their children, too, bore the weight of the experience. Though they were young when it all began, the constant fear and tension had left its mark. The eldest child refused to sleep alone for years, while the youngest developed an aversion to basements and dark spaces. The family tried therapy, but even professionals struggled to untangle the web of paranoia and trauma that had ensnared them. It was as though the Watcher had embedded itself in their very identities, a shadow they couldn't shake no matter how far they moved or how much time passed. Despite their attempts to move forward, the Broaddus family found themselves haunted by the lingering mystery of the Watcher. Derek, unable to let go, began reaching out to other families who had experienced similar harassment. He found stories of anonymous letters, unexplained threats, and even stalkers who had targeted homeowners across the country. While these connections gave him a sense of solidarity, they also deepened his obsession. He started compiling files and timelines, convinced that if he could understand the broader pattern of such cases, he might finally uncover the Watcher's identity. Maria, however, wanted nothing more than to leave it all behind. She avoided conversations about 657 Boulevard entirely and begged Derek to stop his investigations. But even as she tried to bury the past, reminders of their ordeal cropped up everywhere. Friends would bring up the house during casual gatherings. Neighbors would ask if they'd heard anything new, and strangers online continued to speculate about their story. It was as though the Watcher had become a permanent fixture in their lives, a ghost that refused to fade away. As the years went by, the Broaddus family began to notice how the story of the Watcher had taken on a life of its own. Urban legends about 657 Boulevard grew more elaborate with each retelling, and some even claimed the house was cursed. Derek occasionally stumbled upon YouTube videos and podcasts dissecting their case, with strangers confidently theorizing about their lives and motives. Some painted them as victims of a deranged stalker, while others accused them of orchestrating the entire ordeal for attention or profit. The narratives were endless, and none of them felt entirely true. For their children, the notoriety was especially difficult. As they grew older, they encountered classmates who whispered about their family or asked invasive questions about the Watcher. The house that had once symbolized hope for a new beginning had become a source of shame and discomfort. Maria worried about how this legacy would follow her children into adulthood. Would they ever be able to escape the shadow of 657 Boulevard? Or would the Watcher's letters forever define their family in the eyes of others? Derek eventually reached a breaking point. One night, while scrolling through yet another online forum dissecting their case, he slammed his laptop shut and vowed to stop chasing answers. The obsession had consumed him for too long, and he realized it was tearing his family apart. Maria, relieved by his decision, encouraged him to focus on rebuilding their lives instead of dwelling on the past. Together, they began taking small steps toward healing, spending more time with their children, reconnecting with old friends, and trying to reclaim the sense of normalcy they had lost. Still, the specter of the Watcher lingered in subtle ways. Derek found himself jumping at shadows, startled by unexpected knocks at the door or unfamiliar cars parked nearby. Maria continued to double-check locks and windows every night before bed, as if she could physically keep the fear out. Even as they tried to move forward, the trauma remained etched into their daily routines. They had escaped 657 Boulevard, but the Watcher had left an indelible mark on their lives, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. In time, Derek and Maria began to notice how their ordeal had reshaped their understanding of safety and trust. They no longer saw their home as a sanctuary, but as a fragile construct, vulnerable to intrusion and malice. Even in their new house, they avoided forming close relationships with neighbors, fearing that familiarity could open the door to betrayal. Their children, though young when it all began, had absorbed the unease that permeated their family. They grew up cautious, always aware of their surroundings in a way that other kids weren't. Occasionally, Derek would catch himself wondering if the Watcher still kept tabs on 657 Boulevard, or if they had moved on to torment another family. He'd read about the new owners from time to time, relieved that no new letters had been reported, but haunted by the possibility that the Watcher could resurface at any moment. For Derek and Maria, the mystery wasn't just about who the Watcher was. It was about why someone would choose to inflict such calculated cruelty. That question, more than anything else, was what kept them awake at night. Years after selling 657 Boulevard, the Broaddus family tried to find closure in small, personal ways. Maria took up journaling, pouring her thoughts and fears onto paper in an attempt to make sense of their experience. Derek, on the other hand, turned to community service, hoping to channel his lingering frustration into something productive. They avoided interviews and public appearances, refusing to let the media exploit their pain any further. Yet, despite their efforts to move on, the story of the Watcher continued to follow them like a shadow. Even strangers seemed unwilling to let the mystery die. Occasionally, Derek would receive emails or letters from amateur sleuths claiming they had solved the case or offering wild theories about the Watcher's identity. Some suggested it was a jealous neighbor. Others believed it was someone with ties to the house's history. While Derek appreciated the effort, he knew these theories were unlikely to bring him peace. The truth was simple, yet devastating. They might never know who the Watcher was or why they had been targeted. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. As the years passed, the house at 657 Boulevard seemed to fade from public memory. But for the Broaddus family, its impact remained painfully vivid. Maria often found herself replaying specific moments in her mind: the first letter, the cryptic threats, the sleepless nights spent wondering if someone was watching them. She wondered if they had made the right decisions, or if there had been some way to escape the nightmare sooner. Derek, meanwhile, avoided driving anywhere near Westfield. The sight of the house, even in passing, felt like reopening an old wound. Their children grew older and began asking questions about what had happened. Derek and Maria struggled with how much to tell them. Should they share the full truth or shield them from the darkest details? In the end, they decided on honesty, hoping that understanding their family's history would help their children process it. But even with time and transparency, the fear lingered. The Watcher had been more than just a person or a threat. It had become a symbol of everything they couldn't control. And no matter how far they moved or how much time passed, that feeling of helplessness was something they would carry forever. Though the Broaddus family tried to rebuild their lives, the psychological scars left by the Watcher were impossible to ignore. Maria developed a habit of scanning every room she entered, searching for hidden cameras or signs of surveillance. Derek, on the other hand, became hyper-vigilant about their children's safety, insisting on strict rules about where they could play and who they could talk to. Their new home was equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, but even that wasn't enough to ease their minds completely. The fear had burrowed deep into their lives, shaping their routines and relationships in ways they couldn't fully control. Occasionally, Derek would still receive messages from curious strangers or amateur investigators who had stumbled upon the story of 657 Boulevard. Some offered sympathy, while others pushed theories that bordered on absurdity. One person suggested the Watcher was a former resident of the house who believed it held supernatural powers. Another claimed it was part of an elaborate real estate scam. Derek rarely responded to these inquiries anymore. He had learned that chasing answers only led to more frustration. But every now and then he'd open one of the emails and feel a flicker of the old obsession, the need to know why someone had chosen to torment his family. In quieter moments, Maria often reflected on how the Watcher had changed her perception of the world. She used to believe in the goodness of people, in the idea that neighbors could be trusted and communities were built on mutual care. But after years of living under the shadow of 657 Boulevard, that belief was shattered. Now every stranger felt like a potential threat. Every friendly gesture carried an undertone of suspicion. It wasn't just about the Watcher anymore. It was about what their experience had revealed about human nature and the darkness that could hide behind ordinary faces. For Derek, the house had become a symbol of failure. He had tried everything to protect his family, installing cameras, hiring investigators, even confronting neighbors, and none of it had worked. The Watcher had stripped him of his confidence and left him questioning his ability to keep his loved ones safe. Even years later, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had let his family down. And though they rarely spoke about the house anymore, its presence lingered in their lives like an unspoken curse, a reminder of how fragile safety and happiness could be. Despite their efforts to move forward, the Broaddus family found themselves entangled in the legacy of 657 Boulevard. Maria began noticing how even mundane moments, like walking through a grocery store or attending a school event, felt tinged with unease. She couldn't escape the feeling that people were whispering about them, judging them for their ordeal. Derek tried to dismiss these thoughts, but deep down he felt it too. Their story had become a spectacle, a cautionary tale, that people discussed over dinner or dissected in online forums. It was as though the Watcher had succeeded not just in terrorizing them, but in turning their lives into an open book for strangers to read. Occasionally, Derek would catch himself wondering what had become of the house. Did the new owners feel safe there? Had the Watcher moved on? Or were they still lurking in the shadows waiting for another chance to strike? These thoughts haunted him late at night when the house was quiet, and his mind wandered. He hated that he still cared, that after all these years, the Watcher still held power over him. But no matter how hard he tried to push the memories away, they always crept back, like an unwelcome guest he couldn't evict. Over time, the Broaddus family learned to live with the unanswered questions. They stopped searching for closure, accepting that some mysteries would remain unsolved. Maria focused on creating a sense of normalcy for their children, pouring her energy into school activities and family traditions. Derek, though still haunted by the experience, began to channel his frustration into writing. He started drafting a memoir, not for publication, but as a way to process everything they had endured. Putting the story into words felt like reclaiming some of the power the Watcher had stolen from them. But even as they tried to move on, there were moments when the past crept back in. A letter in the mail with no return address would send Maria's heart racing, even if it turned out to be nothing more than junk mail. Derek would occasionally catch himself scanning crowds for familiar faces, wondering if the Watcher could be among them. These habits had become second nature, ingrained by years of fear and vigilance. And while they had escaped 657 Boulevard physically, they knew they might never fully leave it behind emotionally. In the end, 657 Boulevard became more than just a house. It became a symbol of everything the Broaddus family had lost and endured. The Watcher's identity remained a mystery, but its impact was undeniable. The house stood as a reminder of how quickly security could unravel, how even the safest seeming places could harbor unseen threats. For Derek and Maria, it was a lesson in resilience, though one they wished they had never needed to learn. They had survived, but not without scars. As the years passed, the story of the Watcher faded from public attention, replaced by newer scandals and mysteries. But for the Broaddus family, it would always be a part of their history, a dark chapter that shaped who they became. They often wondered if anyone else would ever receive letters from the Watcher, or if the house had finally been left in peace. But perhaps the most haunting thought of all was this: somewhere out there, the Watcher could still be watching. Even as the Broaddus family tried to leave the past behind, the lessons of 657 Boulevard stayed with them. Maria often reminded her children to trust their instincts, to be cautious without being afraid. Derek, meanwhile, became an advocate for privacy and security, sharing their story with close friends as a warning about the dangers of complacency. They had learned firsthand how fragile peace could be and how important it was to protect it. For the Broaddus family, life after the Watcher was about reclaiming what had been stolen. Their sense of safety, their trust in others, and their ability to move forward without fear. Though they would never forget the house or the anonymous letters that had upended their lives, they found solace in knowing they had survived. The Watcher might still be out there, but the Broaddus family refused to let it define them any longer. They were ready to turn the page and write a new chapter, one where fear no longer held them captive. Though the Broaddus family had moved on physically, the psychological remnants of their ordeal lingered in subtle ways. Each member carried their own version of the story, shaped by their unique fears and experiences. For Maria, it was the quiet moments that were the hardest, when the house was still, and her thoughts wandered back to those sleepless nights filled with dread. For Derek, it was the unanswered questions that gnawed at him. The knowledge that someone out there had watched them, studied them, and chosen to torment them for reasons they might never understand. But despite everything, they found strength in each other. The Watcher had tried to fracture their family to sow fear and paranoia, but it had failed. They had endured together, weathering a storm that might have broken others. And though 657 Boulevard would always be a part of their story, it no longer defined them. In its place was something stronger, a family that had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. They were no longer just survivors, they were something more.